Welcome to today's Global Connections program. I'm Bill Miller. Today we're going to be taking a look at this horrific situation, this war between Israel and Hamas. My guest is an expert on this topic. Dr. Michael Cairo is a professor of political science, and he is the program director of international affairs at Transylvania University in Lexington, Kentucky. His most recent book is American Presidents and Israeli Settlements since 1967. Dr. Mike Cairo, welcome to today's Global Connections program.
Thanks, Bill. It's always nice to be here with you. Good to see you again.
Same here. I wish we were under more pleasant circumstances. That's the only problem,
That,
but we're going to resolve all the problems. I can tell that right now.
oh, I'm
But
sure.
yeah, that's right. But why don't we jump into it? I mentioned your book, and I know this book was written a couple of years ago, but are there any lessons that you could pull out of that book that would apply to what
Oh,
happened today here with on October 7th of 2023 when Hamas made this horrific attack on the Israelis, or
one
even
of the
building up to it. It's just
Yeah, I
one
think one of the
event.
important things for us to think about, and I appreciate you mentioning the book, but one of the more important things to think about is that the Israeli settlement project emerged after the 1967 June or Six-Day War, as the Israelis call it, after Israel occupied the Gaza Strip, the West Bank, Golan Heights. And that settlement project has been an obstacle to the peace process in part. Because if you look at the West Bank and where settlements are, it would be very difficult to carve a state out of the West Bank without creating conflict for Israeli settlers, which are a large measure and a large part of the government that is supporting Netanyahu right now, for example. Additionally, I think we often think of the peace process without thinking about the obstacles to peace. And one of the obstacles that we could think about to peace is the U.S.-Israeli relationship and how that relationship is either evolved or not evolved. And while Trump certainly went all in with Israel in his first administration and moving the embassy to Jerusalem, basically giving Netanyahu carte blanche on some settlement activities, his ambassador at that time was actually an ardent supporter of settlers. Um, the U.S. has been a supporter implicitly and in some cases very explicitly of Israel's pattern of occupation. And that makes the question of the U.S. as an honest broker quite difficult, especially now with another Trump administration.
Exactly. Were there any events? There have been so many, I'm sure, probably 50, but was there one thing that really triggered this October 7th, 2023 attack? Is there one thing? Some people say it was the pending deal with the Saudis. Some say it was something else. Is there anything in particular that really triggered it?
I don't know that I would put it to any one issue. I certainly think that an impending deal with the Saudis could have moved Hamas in the direction that it went. The Abraham Accords that the Trump administration had put together was really, in some senses, picking off Arab states to align, at least economically, closer with Israel, which isolated Hamas increasingly. This is a pattern that's been happening to the Palestinians, though, for a long time. If you go back to the Camp David Accords, while the Camp David Accords with President Carter are hailed as a great success, and they were in some ways, the agreement between Israel and Egypt essentially removed Egypt from the process as a supporter of Palestine. And so the Palestinian people had to look elsewhere. And in a sense, yes, Saudi Arabia might be one trigger. But another trigger might simply be the fact that there's a lot of frustration among the Palestinian people. frustration about the situation, about the fact that you've seen increasing settlers and settlements in the West Bank, about the Netanyahu government, which has been in power for a long time, despite a small interregnum with a different set of leaders, um, and about, quite frankly, the world community's inability, I guess we could say, to really produce positive outcomes for them. So there's that frustration. You could also cite Israeli belief in invulnerability. This is similar to 1973 in a sense, and the October War, the Yom Kippur War, the Ramadan War, when you had a situation where Israel thought it was impenetrable to attack and where Netanyahu thought he was riding this high of Mr. Security. That you could argue opened up an opportunity for Hamas as well, in a sense, for that October 7th very horrific attack on Israel.
Yeah. And there were several warning lights that went off that to the Israeli security folks that indicated there was going to be some type of an attack, but they ignored them, just much like what happened with 9/11 in the United States when some of the federal agencies ignored warnings of what potentially could happen.
Yeah, I think there was a whole host of intelligence warnings that something could or might happen. I think two things to this. One is that Israel never believed, much like we didn't believe, that terrorists could attack in the way that they did. It wasn't a particularly, if you think about the October 7th attack or 9/11, since you bring up 9/11, neither attack is particularly sophisticated in terms of the weapons used. It's not, an all-out missile launch. It's not a dirty bomb. It's not chemical, biological, or nuclear weapons. And so I think the intelligence services thought it was unfathomable to believe that Hamas could pull something like this off. That goes along with what I said earlier about this sense of invulnerability, that Netanyahu's Mr. Security, there's no way they would dare do such a thing, that this could happen in any kind of Israeli state in this moment.
Very shaky agreement right now. There's been a pause in this conflict, if you want to put it that way, I guess. And the situation, as I understand it, Joe Biden said that they could have had this back in May. It's basically the
This is the
same
same
deal.
agreement, that was put forward in May. It was halted mainly by Netanyahu at the time. But go ahead. I didn't know if you had more that you wanted to say before
No,
I.
that was pretty
Okay.
much that was it.
Okay.
Just get your
Um,
comments.
what is important to understand here is that Israel operates under a coalition government.
Mhm.
No Israeli prime minister's political party has won an outright majority. There are 120 seats in the Knesset. You need 61 to really control the Knesset at all. Israel's cabinet with Netanyahu right now has to approve any aspects of this deal. So while he got a ceasefire through with the release of hostages and the release of Palestinian prisoners as part of this, he has a real significant problem, and that problem is that his coalition includes parties that are to his right, parties that are ultra orthodox or are movement parties that support the settlement movement. So his national security advisor, as a result of this, resigned on Sunday after this. He actually threatened to resign if this deal got through the cabinet, Itamar Ben-Gvir, and he resigned in protest for this deal. Um, while that didn't bring down the government, it does raise questions about how far Netanyahu can go without causing a collapse of the government. He's facing criticism on the left and on the right. Now, Yair Lapid, his main opponent, has said he will prevent a collapse of the government at this time. But the reality is that Lapid and Netanyahu don't like one another. So you've got that problem to deal
That's
with.
hard to
Um,
believe.
yeah. So Netanyahu is playing a balancing game um, that he knows if he makes the wrong step and his government collapses, he is not very popular with the people either. He's unlikely to be prime minister much longer or get reelection potentially. So Netanyahu is playing a balancing game both at home and internationally. Now, you add to this the fact that in May he didn't feel pressured by an incoming Trump administration. I'm not going to say that Trump gets credit for a deal, but certainly Trump and Netanyahu's relationship is much better than Biden and Netanyahu's relationship was. And Trump wanted something done because he doesn't want to have to deal with this problem. The reality is he's going to have to deal with this problem. And I'm not sure that Netanyahu is going to be able to get this deal much further without a true coalition shakeup, which he cannot afford.
That's exactly where we'll leave it for a moment. And when we come back after the mid show, we'll talk a little bit about the Trump policies versus the Biden policies. Well, you're watching Global Connections Television, which is a privately funded, independently produced program. The opinions expressed on Global Connections are solely those of the moderator and his guests. We'd invite our viewers to go to our website at www.globalconnectionstelevision.com to view previous programs. Also, if you're involved with the PBS or community access television station, or perhaps an educational institution that has an intra-campus television hookup, or you have a podcast, or you just have a computer. You like our show and you would like to share it, please feel free to do so. Global Connections Television is provided at no cost as a public service to help us better understand international issues and how they impact our lives. Today, we're looking at the situation with the Israelis and Hamas. My guest today is an expert on this topic. Dr. Michael Cairo is a professor of political science, and he's the program director of international affairs at Transylvania University in Lexington. Mike, we're talking about this. We're talking about two different administrations. What we know kind of what the Biden policies are. What can we expect from the Trump policies?
Well, one of the things that I think we have to be aware of is that there is, in a way, a strange continuity at the moment. For all their differences, I mean, Trump has been very critical of Biden. Biden can't get a deal here. Biden can't fix this. There wouldn't have been a war on my watch. His supporters cheered this idea of America first, right? That he'll somehow be tougher and a better deal maker. The reality here is that when Biden came into office, he didn't change much in the Trump policy. I mean, he didn't move the embassy out of Jerusalem. He didn't reverse course on settlements. And despite his, yes, applying a little bit more pressure to Netanyahu on humanitarian issues, there really wasn't much change in terms of weapons. We've actually been very supportive of Israel in terms of our military support of Israel and that alliance. He hadn't, Biden didn't really shift course that much. The big difference is going to be, I think, in humanitarian aid, particularly to the Palestinians. In the first Trump administration, the Trump administration cut aid to the Palestinians to the United Nations Relief and Works Agency significantly. And so I think you're going to see a change in humanitarian aid. And it's likely that you will see, and this is what the right wing in Netanyahu's coalition is hoping for, but a wider latitude for Israel to do what, quote, Israel has to do to get the job done. The big problem is no one is quite clear what that means to get the job done when we think about Israel and Israeli strategy and Netanyahu's endgame here.
Yeah, and there are a lot of observers who feel that really Joe Biden and Donald Trump, if they've both been co-presidents, would have probably followed the same policies as far as the pressure put on the Hamas and other players, Hezbollah and some of the others. It
Yeah.
probably would not have changed much.
No, no, we're not going to see, I don't think we're going to see any major changes at all. In fact, though, what is interesting is that this may be a good case of be careful what you wish for. We have to ask, what has Netanyahu really gained in the last year plus? Hamas, yeah, sure, it's degraded, it's weaker, but look what's happened after this phase deal. Hamas is essentially in control of Gaza. Who else is there? There isn't really another alternative. The people are generally supportive of them. In some cases, maybe more after what's happened. Um, it's not clear how Netanyahu gets out of this game. You could say the same in the north with Hezbollah, right? You've got a degraded or limited Hezbollah, but now you've got a humanitarian crisis starting on Israel's northern border in Lebanon. You could turn to Syria, where everyone hailed, oh, the Bashar al-Assad regime collapsed. And don't get me wrong, Bashar al-Assad was a horrific dictator in Syria. But now you've got Abu Muhammad al-Golani in charge, someone that the United States has deemed a terrorist in the past, someone whose forces are made up of jihadis, and now they're major players in the region. And not only are they major players, but they're actually talking about asking Russia to stay because they need to rebuild their military. So you've got that aspect of it. Then we could even turn to Iran, right? Iran has been significantly weakened by Netanyahu's actions against Iran. But at the end of the day, the Netanyahu's actions, which were hailed by much of the world community, may actually end up encouraging Iran to pursue nuclear weapons quicker and faster because its conventional weaponry has been degraded to the point where it can't respond, and now it may be concerned that Netanyahu or Israel may try to strike again, or Saudi Arabia or someone else, since they're weakened in the region. So in some ways, this is a case where we may end up with something that we didn't want to have, and it might be worse than what we had before.
Yes, be careful what you wish for. That's
Yeah.
very, very true. That you mentioned about the nuclear weapons with Iran. Of course, remember back to the Trump administration, a lot of foreign policy experts say that one of the biggest mistakes was to pull out of the Iranian nuclear deal. And just as you mentioned, they really have no limits as to what they could do if they want to do it. There are many reasons why they may not move more quickly, but it is a problem. Well, you mentioned UNRWA, the United Nations Relief and Works Agency. That was a critical player. It kept Palestinians and other folks in that area really alive for decades. And here it's been almost decimated, but apparently they had something like 13,000 employees, and something like four or five or six of them were accused of working with Hamas, which, to tell you the truth, that's a pretty low number. That's extremely low, if indeed it is true. But if you pull UNRWA out or don't fund it, who's going to work with the people? And Gaza is nothing but a pile of rubble. About 80%
Yeah.
of it seems like it's dead. You've got over 45,000 Gazans killed, or Palestinians killed.
Yeah, and the
So
United
who is
Nations
going to
is
work?
now reporting 46,000
46,000.
potentially now killed. Yeah.
So
You've
who
got
is going to work? Who's going to try to help rebuild it? Who's going to pay
well
for it?
that's a huge question, and that's part of this. What is Netanyahu's end game? Without the UN, you're going to have a major problem. You got 46,000 Palestinians across Gaza killed. Over 100,000 have been injured. Around a quarter of those require lifelong care. You've got countless more people missing or trapped that we don't know. The full and final count of either dead or injured. You've got infrastructure that's been destroyed. You have about 90% of a population of 2 to 2.2 million people that have been displaced, and not displaced just once, but in multiple times in some cases. They've been moved and moved back and moved again. You have with the humanitarian organizations, what was particularly concerning is that the last 3 months of the Biden administration, the last 3 months of 2024, saw the lowest amounts of aid going into Gaza. Since this crisis began, you've had, in terms of aid workers, they're also under threat. You've had 350 or a little more than that were killed. You have, and of those, I think about 200 to 250 were UN workers. I don't have the exact number there, but I think there was about that many. Um, you have just simply unsafe areas with people returning to these unsafe areas. You have strained resources with food, water, medical care. You have infectious disease, including polio, is now skyrocketing in the region. Um, so you have a food crisis, food insecurity. You need World Food Program and programs going in to deal with that. In the North Gaza, they're already saying it's a famine, and that famine is imminent. 90% of the people in Gaza right now are facing acute food insecurity. So this is a really critical moment for the world community, and not just the United States, but for the world community. Because if we're not willing to provide humanitarian aid, if we're not willing to try and help the UN provide humanitarian aid, this is going to be an even more catastrophic crisis than it already is.
It certainly is. There's no doubt about it. And this problem is not going to go away. People think, well, we'll just ignore it. We'll let
Yeah,
them deal with it. Well, we've
yeah.
seen how that's gone. That's not going to happen. But it's truly, truly one of the worst crises possibly ever. Well, I won't say ever. We look at the world wars, but it's certainly one of the major ones. Well, who do you think will ultimately wind up? Well, first off, do you think Netanyahu is going to try to annex Gaza and the West Bank, or who
Now,
do you think who should be who might be governing those areas?
well, you've still got, of course, Fatah and Hamas. They're really the only two alternatives, and Hamas is really the only alternative in Gaza, and Fatah is the alternative, I guess you would say, in the West Bank. The real problem here is that within those areas, the question of who governs is very complex because Israel occupies. Even in Gaza, Israel didn't occupy before October 7th, 2023. But what Israel did was embargo it to such an extent that Israel controlled the activities in and out and within the area. In the West Bank, Israel is essentially occupying. Now, you asked a question about annexation, which is a really important one. It's one of the reasons why Netanyahu probably won't be able to go much further with this deal because the coalition government that he has and some of the parties to his right, and he has 68, 67 now members of that coalition. Um, but the coalition that he has to his right, um, many of them see Trump's victory and Trump's inauguration as carte blanche to start annexing areas of the West Bank. But annexing the West Bank is not going to be as easy, and even some of those also say Gaza. Um, but annexing the West Bank is not as easy as it sounds. I mean, you're talking about taking on a population of roughly 2 million Palestinians. One of the big challenges for Israel since its inception is that it wants to be a Jewish state. To be a Jewish state, you have to have a Jewish majority. You take on 2 million Palestinians, and suddenly you're going to start changing the demographic makeup of the state, which is why many Israelis on the right, Netanyahu to some extent, have seen control better than annexation. But now he's dealing with people who think we can annex and the United States is going to support us in doing it. And that might be one of the biggest changes from Biden to Trump. The permissive structure that some world leaders will now believe they have with a Trump administration versus a Biden administration.
And you have some members of the Knesset, some of the far right parties, they want to deport the Palestinians. They will send them where to Ethiopia, some of the
Yeah, there is
African
this.
countries.
Yeah, there is an argument to remove the Palestinians. This is particularly in Gaza. So let's just occupy it and remove the Palestinians. The problem there, as you well know, is the Palestinians have to be accepted somewhere.
Right. It's not a matter of putting them
That's
on a
just a
plane.
minor
That's
problem,
it.
right? That's
Yeah,
just a
that's
minor
it.
problem. The
Right.
other problem is
Uh,
you're removing people from their homes forcibly.
mhm.
And women and children. You've got children who are facing the biggest crisis here. And so it just is going to mount or create an even larger humanitarian crisis if
Mhm.
that kind of policy becomes the policy of the Israeli government.
Mhm. Well, it's I know it's awfully difficult to predict what will happen in that part of the world, but by the time our show airs right now, that peace deal may have fallen apart already.
I,
The
yeah,
odds
I
are
don't think the
it
peace deal is going to last as long as people hope.
no, I totally agree with you. I think you're absolutely right. Yeah. Well, you were talking too about absorbing 2 million Palestinians into on the West Bank, for example. That really, if the Israelis did not give these Palestinians democratic rights, they would really be running an apartheid state, much like the
Some
one in
people
South
are.
Africa.
Yeah,
They're
some people
already
argue that they
already
already
doing it.
are to
Yes.
some extent. And there are those out there, that ask the question, well, why are we talking about a two-state solution anymore? There already is a solution. The solution is a one-state solution, but it's a one-state solution where those territories aren't annexed. In other words, those territories are simply controlled by Israel, in a sense. So we're already uh, approaching that question of is Israel an apartheid state? And some people do raise that question.
Yeah. Well, Mike, you're an expert on this topic, and if you were advising President Trump, but uh, Prime Minister Netanyahu, what would you recommend they do now?
Oof. I mean, that's
Yeah,
a huge
easy
question.
question.
I mean, I think the first thing has to be a focus on humanitarianism. Um, I'm not sure, and I'll just say this, I'm not sure that either man's interested in humanitarianism at the moment or in the last year. But I think there has to be a focus on helping those individuals. And I'm not talking about the leaders of Hamas. I'm not talking about those who committed terrorist acts, but those individuals, children, families who are just trying to survive. Um, get more aid in, distribute the aid better, and vitalize the United Nations operations and other operations on the ground. Um, but I feel like, and even the Biden administration can be criticized for this to some extent. I feel like the aid has been a like a trickling faucet. The
Mhm.
faucet needs to be turned on. You can't just have it dripping and getting little bits in to really stem the humanitarian crisis. And the humanitarian crisis is only going to get worse if we sit back and think it's just going to go away.
Exactly. And there, we remember the scenes where there were dozens and dozens of WFP, World Food Program trucks lined up, and they couldn't get into Gaza because Israel wouldn't let them in. Of course,
Yep,
a lot of people, to their surprise, didn't realize the WFP was a UN agency, the World Food Program, and
absolutely.
the
But it's
UN is
critical,
absolutely critical. The World Health
especially when you're
Organization.
dealing with places where you are. This is a near famine situation.
Oh yes,
Um,
yep.
you know, most of the people facing the worst are under the age of 5. Under
Hmm.
the age of 5, we're seeing severe malnutrition for children under the age of 5. I think it's going to be a hard sell to argue that those kids under the age of 5 are terrorists,
Yeah,
and we ought to do something to stem the crisis.
exactly. And regardless of what happens, the United Nations will play a role in this, and it'll play a major role. And I believe you have a UN flag behind you. I don't see the logo, but I do. Oh, there you go.
You go.
I saw the blue, the UN blues.
Yeah, it's
So
there. It's there.
excellent way to close it. But anyway, Dr. Mike Cairo, I want to thank you so very much for a very interesting and a very informative program.
Thank you, Bill.
My pleasure. I'm Bill Miller. Thank you for joining us today on Global Connections Television.